hppodcraft.com.
Welcome to HP Podcraft, the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast. I'm Chris Lackey.
I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And we are here to talk about the works, the very specific works of H.P. Lovecraft.
That's right. H.P. Lovecraft is a famous author in the 20th century. He wrote a lot of horror and science fiction stories, what were called at the time weird fiction.
Weird
and
fiction. What
we'd like to do, we're both huge fans. We're not scholars.
We're not scholars. We're not. Well, Chad has his degree in English literature, I believe.
True, but I didn't take a single class about H.P. Lovecraft.
Yes, and I have. I'm actually illiterate and can't. No, that's not true. I'm just a fan. And an amateur scholar, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so what we want to do here is each week cover one of the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, talk about maybe its larger relevance, what was going on in the story,
yep,
what we liked about it, what we think it, if we think it advanced the genre of weird fiction.
Also, criticisms. We'll talk about criticisms of those particular stories by different scholars and people that are just into H.P. Lovecraft. We will, at the end of the episode, this particular episode, we'll tell you what we're going to study the next episode, so you can read it. And if you don't feel like reading it, you can just listen to the podcast, and you'll probably know all you need to know about it, and you could fake it to your friends and pretend that you did read it.
It will make you much more popular
yes,
among almost any group of people to know a lot about H.P. Lovecraft. So think of this, if not as a way to indulge some of your literary hobbies, but also to make friends.
Yes.
And become cool.
It's true. Basically, I think Chad and I both picked up all women that we've ever dated in our entire life using H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, it's basically, that's how I get in. I go, well, think of the name, Lovecraft.
Absolutely.
When you read and you know about H.P. Lovecraft, eventually you will be able to execute Lovecraft.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know what I'm talking about. Why don't we...
So on this first episode, since we haven't set it up with the story yet, we figured we should just talk about H.P. Lovecraft, a general overall view of the man.
So, concisely, who H.P. Lovecraft is, he was as I said before, an early 20th century writer. He was born in 1890 and he died, I think, in the late 30s.
37.
And he wrote supernatural fiction and science fiction stories, which at the time were called weird fiction. He wasn't quite recognized in his lifetime, but he's gone on to be a huge influence. Stephen King has acknowledged him as the 20th century's greatest master.
Clive Barker.
You'll see his influence in all sorts of literary and film and TV endeavors.
Yep.
He sort of created a mythology that most of his stories are set in.
Yeah,
about the things that
he had his worldview. That's kind of a through line in all of his stories. Is that there are these aliens/gods that exist out in the universe, and they're pretty malevolent, and there is no nice, sweet, loving God that exists out in the universe. It's just these things, and that we as humans are kind of alone, and it's pretty bleak.
Yeah, it's bleak and it's horrifying, and it's quite different than other horror writers and what they usually address. He did not write about werewolves or vampires.
No.
He did not write about ghosts.
No.
It was never about trying to get control over a supernatural world and eventually succeeding by learning about it.
No, it was the opposite.
It was the opposite, which is that the more you uncover and the more you know, the crazier you go.
Yeah.
Because the more you realize that humans are completely insignificant as far as the cosmos goes. We really don't matter. And if there's any logic behind why we're all here or what the cosmos is about, it's an insane logic that you could never possibly understand.
Yeah, no.
The more you do understand it, the more insane you yourself will go.
Well, a lot of his stories, are based. They tell about ancient races that once lived on Earth that had great civilizations that died out. It's kind of him acknowledging, hey, you know what, we've got this great civilization, but guess what? It's only temporary. All things have a beginning and an end, and our time will end.
Exactly. And a lot of people call this the Cthulhu mythos.
Yes.
The reason they call it that is because Cthulhu, which we say Cthulhu, it's supposed to be an unpronounceable kind of name.
Yeah,
but
it's like Cthulhu.
that's as close as we can get to it, is basically a Godzilla kind of figure. It's a giant monster that sleeps down in the bottom of the ocean.
Well,
I'm trying to make it relatable.
Okay, sure.
It's a giant tentacled monster that lives down in the ocean.
It's like hundreds of feet tall.
It's down there sleeping. Eventually, it's going to rise up out of the ocean and just devastate huge portions of the planet, right?
Yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah.
And all of these other characters that are related to that are all tied up in this thing called the Cthulhu mythos that he wrote stories stories in. And he was a correspondent with a number of other literary figures at the time, probably most famously Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, who was just a teenager when Lovecraft wrote to him.
Robert E. Howard, who did the Conan novels.
He shared this whole mythos that he created, which I think is in contrast to a lot of literary figures like Tolkien, who didn't necessarily share Middle Earth with other people.
Yeah, other people didn't write stories that took place in Middle Earth.
And I think that it connects with the online culture now, where people are writing fan fiction in worlds that they like. They feel, if you watch the show, I don't know, any science fiction show, you watch Quantum Leap or Lost or Star Trek, people feel like, hey, I put a lot of time and effort into this, and I own it too, and I want to be a part of it, and I want to tell stories in that genre. And H.P. Lovecraft really encouraged that, which is why I think when we're working on our projects now, it never feels like sacrilege. It never feels like we're doing anything wrong with the properties that he created, because he encouraged people to use it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, whether or not he would actually enjoy it.
No, I think that he would hate most of the stuff that we're doing.
Yeah, probably,
but he would encourage it at least. Why is H.P. Lovecraft personally relevant to you?
Personally relevant to me?
I mean, when did you have your first connection with this author?
I would have to say it was with the role-playing game. And
role-playing game is a game where you make up characters.
Yeah, you make up characters.
Play through scenarios.
You sit at a table. Some people dress up and do things, which I'm all into. But typically, when I was younger, all I did was we sit at a table. A bunch of people would make up their own characters. One person would be in charge, and he would say what was going on in the story, and you would make decisions just for your character.
So it was sort of like Dungeons and Dragons, except instead of that fantasy world, it was in the early 20th century world of H.P. Lovecraft.
Yes. Gotcha. And this idea of a universe that is really dark, that there is no hope, that there's no heaven, there's no afterlife, these gods and things God doesn't exist. There's just these horrible monsters that are going to, hopefully you'll die before you ever have to deal with them. But if you ever have to deal with these things, your sanity will be shattered and you'll see your entire world destroyed.
Yeah.
And that was cool to me. Like, it was so different. I've never read anything like that. And like you were saying before, usually supernatural stories are about people learning to understand them and then overcome them. And this is, you're never going to overcome this, and you're never going to understand it. And you're better off not knowing these things.
Yeah, you're better off being ignorant.
But it's kind of interesting because, this is when Einstein and, the scientific quantum theory and all these things were starting to come out. Mm-hmm. And Lovecraft himself, a big astronomy buff, would study these things. And these are the feelings that he would get. It would be like, I can't even begin to fathom how big the universe is.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was a little kid. I remember I would lay awake at night thinking about infinity. I mean, the universe goes on infinitely. That means it never ends. So that concept alone was blowing my little young mind, and I remember telling my dad that and having him say, don't think about those things because it'll drive you crazy. That was his answer. But and that's, I think, why H.P. Lovecraft's modus operandi kind of touched me, or I was interested in, because it's all about how the universe is crazy and random. And I know that in my young life, it wasn't necessarily that hard, but it wasn't great. And a lot of things would come out of nowhere, and I had no control over them. Yeah. And when I read H.P. Lovecraft, it appealed to me because he really had an understanding of that fear, that any given day,
anything can happen.
Anything could happen, and you can't control it. No. And the more you know about it, the more sick you get. Which I think that a lot of you could call them nerds or nerd culture. A lot of people who are fans of H.P. Lovecraft are people who maybe didn't feel like they had a lot of control in their life at certain periods.
When you have trouble dealing with society, I think it's easy to want to think that it doesn't matter. Like, it's not important because you're not doing a good job in society. Right. You're not being successful. And a good defense for that, not good, but a defense for that is that, all that stuff is bullshit. It doesn't mean anything. It
doesn't matter.
He lived, he didn't
Let's talk about his life. So he was...
His family was somewhat wealthy when he was a young child. His dad was a traveling salesman who went insane when he was very young and was institutionalized.
Which must have been horrible.
Probably.
But he was very young. He was like 3 years old.
He was like 3 years old when.
And what drove his dad insane? Was it having such a sissy nerd kid?
It was probably the nerd kid that ticked him. No, it's.
What I read is that he just went. He had a psychotic episode in a hotel room in Chicago, and then that was the end of it. He was catatonic after that.
It was the syphilis.
And we think it was the
We
syphilis.
think it was the syphilis.
Okay.
I mean, from, historically speaking, it seems like it was the syphilis. He was a traveling salesman. You do the math.
Okay. Let me get a pencil and do the math.
Do the math right there.
Yep, it's the syphilis.
It's the syphilis. Okay. So he ended up living with his maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, and his mother and his 2 aunts, which I believe are his mom's sisters.
Right. So he was surrounded by all of these women. And his grandfather, as I understand it, encouraged his literary efforts, gave him books, and actually it's just like how I discovered H.P. Lovecraft. My uncle, who was the only one handing me books and encouraging me, gave me a copy of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which was the first thing that I read. So, good for him that he had somebody like that in his life, although I don't think Grandpa was around.
He wasn't.
Okay.
No, he died in 1904, so he was 14.
He was around for a while, but in those early years, Lovecraft actually didn't go to school.
No.
Because he was too sick, or at least he was pretending to be too sick.
Yeah, they said he was often argumentative at school and would have problems just dealing with people.
Right.
But he was really into science. He studied astronomy. When he was like 9 years old, he wrote periodicals like the Scientific Gazette in 1899. So yeah, he was 9.
So he was mostly self-educated. He read the books his grandfather gave him, and he avoided school, I think, until around high school when he actually did attend. And so he had a rough early life. Now, one thing that I've read, or at least I've heard a lot, and you can tell me if this is crazy. I know his mother was institutionalized later.
Yes.
But a lot of people told me that she dressed him like a little girl when he was a kid.
Yes. Okay. Here's the thing. In the turn of the century, boys and girls were dressed, little boys and girls were dressed in dresses. Like, that's just how it was.
Everybody was?
Everybody was. They would have little frilly outfits. When you were a baby, you wore, little dresses. Like, that's just it. Like, I've seen pictures of, I think my great-grandfather has a little dress on. If you go back, look at any old pictures of young little kids.
Okay, so let me ask you, was that a common thing in the 70s?
No.
Oh, okay.
But
both of his parents were nuts. I mean, it's safe.
Yeah,
to say.
his mom, there was a lot, supposedly his mom was very critical of him, but also very affectionate to him. And there was, some people say, which I don't necessarily agree with, because it seems pretty tenuous, is that she kind of had some weird fetish for her son. Not that anything ever happened, but she kind of doted over him. And
was that normal at the time?
And no, and dressed him up in her husband's clothes. When he got old enough, he wore his, which I think they were poor. Even though his family was wealthy, this is what happened when his grandfather passed away, which when he was 14, and that was something that was devastating to him because that was kind of his father figure.
Right.
They mismanaged. The money was mismanaged. So when his grandfather died, they became poor, and they had to move out of his childhood home.
Oh, right.
And
into a much smaller
place, and that really gave him some problems. He was suicidal at the time. It was a big issue. What got him really into writing?
Okay.
Is there was this amateur movement that was kind of going on. He would write letters into magazines and kind of critique stories. Like, he hated the stupid romantic stories that were going on at the time. And he sort of got recognized as this guy who wrote letters and critiques. And so he kind of hooked up with an amateur group, which were these just group of writers, and they would do self-publications and things like that. This whole time, though, he never graduated high school either, because
he came close, but he bombed out.
Yeah, he just kind of went a little nuts.
Yeah.
Some people theorize that he had a problem with math, mathematics was an issue for him.
So he got into writing through the Amateur Association.
Yes.
And he probably when did he start getting published?
1917 was when The Tomb was written.
And all right, so from 1917 on, he was writing pretty regularly.
No.
And then he...
No, actually wasn't.
No?
He was not a very regular writer. He wasn't even making his living at it. He didn't really start doing a bulk of his work until
much later.
Until much later.
And now, when he became older, he got married, right?
He did, but that wasn't until after his mom died. And his mom died when he was 31? It was 1921. So yeah, he would be 31 when his mom died. And then he quickly hooked up with somebody.
Okay. Sonia Green is this woman that he married. She's 7 years older than him.
She's 7 years older than him.
Maybe it's some replacement for his mother.
Could be.
Maybe he dressed her up in his mother's clothes, because that's what he learned.
That is pure speculation on your
part.
Pure
speculation, but you heard it here first. After that happened, he moves to New York with this woman.
Yes.
And she owns a hat shop out there.
Yes.
And Lovecraft can't get any work.
No.
So he's hanging out in the apartment, kind of moping around,
Whether he
corresponding
can't
with
get
people.
work or doesn't want to get work.
Yeah, we're not sure.
Yeah.
And they're in Brooklyn, and things are a little rocky. Her hat shop goes under, and so she has to leave to go find some work.
Yeah, she kind of leaves him alone in New York.
And he's alone in New York, and that's when he wrote the screenplay for Crooklyn, I think.
No? I think Home Alone 2 is what you're thinking. Yeah.
None of that happened. But he was in Brooklyn alone. He hated New York, and some people think, a lot of people criticize Lovecraft because he was something of a racist.
Yes.
And they think that a lot of that came from his time in New York when he was dealing with a very ethnic population.
Yes.
He disliked.
And he was from a small, Providence, obviously a much different vibe than New York City.
Right.
And he really had a hard time dealing with that. And a lot of times his racism is rather inconsistent because his wife was Jewish, even though he would complain about foreigners, Jewish people, whatever.
And a lot of that might have been part of his affectation, which is that he was an Anglophile. Even the way he writes, it sounds like he's somebody from England 100 years before he was alive. I mean, he very much so had this. He called himself grandfather, I think, sometimes when he wrote to people in letters, even though he was in his 30s.
Yeah, I did.
He just sort of wanted to be an old European all the time.
Right.
And I think part of that might have been, played into his racism and his feeling that other cultures were not.
Yeah, and it was a different period. A different, it's, as much as I hate to, give people a pass on that, you just have to,
It wasn't a huge part of his work. There's some descriptive things sometimes in stories where you can tell that maybe he doesn't like.
Right.
Some
the
other
horror
races.
of Red Hook, which was the neighborhood he lived in Brooklyn when he wrote the story, it's pretty heavily, you can tell that he has some racist feelings about stuff.
But ultimately, he kind of thought everybody was horrible.
Oh, right, yeah.
At core.
He hated everyone. He hated people in general.
Now, after that time in Brooklyn, I think his marriage sort of fell apart, and he wound up moving back to Providence to live with his aunts. And that was those sort of last 10 years of his life where he was super productive.
Right.
And he wrote most of the stories that today we draw from and that we know.
Yeah.
And that we'll be covering on this podcast. He ghost wrote for other people, and most famously for Harry Houdini. He wrote a story for Harry Houdini. And he sold all of his stories in a pulp magazine that was popular at the time called Weird Tales. He didn't make a ton of money from it. I think at one point they offered him an editorial job on the magazine in Chicago, but he didn't move out to take it. And eventually at age 47, he
died March 15th, 1937.
He had intestinal cancer.
Intestinal cancer, and he was he was afraid of doctors,
right?
Of course, and if it was diagnosed earlier, he might have been fine. But
and he also had some pretty bad malnutrition, which was probably partially due to his disease and also due to his bad eating habits.
It was renowned. Like he was bragging in one of his letters about how he could live on a can of beans and a loaf of bread for a week, and he just was a guy who didn't like to eat, which is
he's probably afraid of food.
He's probably afraid of food.
So, there's a lot more to cover here, and I think as we go through the stories, we'll get a little further into H.P. Lovecraft's biography, but those are the basic facts. One thing that I just saw on the news a couple of weeks ago is that Universal Studios is planning on doing a movie about H.P. Lovecraft, directed by Ron Howard.
Yeah.
And maybe a fictional accounting based on a comic book about his life.
Right, yeah. If you've read this, and this is one of the things that, irks me and many Lovecraft fans, is where a few times, this H.P. Lovecraft character, who's kind of this, they think that, H.P. Lovecraft himself was sort of a Indiana Jones type of guy that, went out in the world and found all these old books and did all these things. And supposedly in that story, I think Lovecraft has a sword and, you know what I mean? I
think it's called The Strange Adventures of H.P. Lovecraft is the title of the comic.
And H.P. Lovecraft, looking at his history, didn't do anything like that.
He was in his room all the time.
He was not that kind of person, and unfortunately, that annoys me. I remember there was a movie. There was a movie that came out too, which
there was a Necronomicon was movie. A movie,
where Jeffrey Combs plays H.P. Lovecraft,
right?
And he's got a sword cane, and he punches some guys.
And I can sort of see why that would happen, because in most of H.P. Lovecraft's stories, the protagonists were really thinly veiled versions of himself.
Yes.
Although they didn't get into a lot of adventures or hijinks, and there was nary a woman to be found. There wasn't any romance going on.
No. And the one story that I can think of that there was romance, it turned out to be a woman's grandfather possessed her body and married the guy.
It's really horribly screwed up.
Yeah.
But and I think that some fans would, they just don't like a lot of the entertainment that's based on his work out there.
Right.
And there's two problems with it. One is some of it is so intellectually horrifying that it's basically unfilmable. It's really hard to make a movie.
It's conceptual horror.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a concept that is horrible, and
Right.
you can't really film a concept.
But, From Beyond, it has a lot of nudity and sex in it.
Right.
That people
Which
say
Lovecraft, of course,
he was not a big fan of.
No.
But I would argue, hey, he's a guy who shares his stuff with people, so there's no reason that you couldn't run off and do that.
Absolutely not.
Or some of his adaptations of his works are excessively gory, like Reanimator, another Stuart Gordon movie. And then you have there were a lot of films, the Evil Dead series. We mentioned the Necronomicon a minute ago. One of the things that H.P. Lovecraft created that he shared among a lot of writers was the Necronomicon, which was this ancient tome that would perhaps drive you crazy if you read it. And
yes, it was written by the mad Arab who
Right.
supposedly, after he wrote the book, was ripped apart by unseen forces in the middle of a bazaar, like in the middle of day.
Yeah. So the Necronomicon is one of those things that people think actually exists because H.P. Lovecraft, created it. Other writers shared it. It got mentioned in so many things that people started to think, well, this must be a real book, but it's not.
No, it's not a real thing.
It is the reason that Ash gets in so much trouble in the Evil Dead series, however, is because he plays the tape recorder with readings.
We have a story about the Chad and I. When we were younger, we fell under this lie, if you will, that the Necronomicon was actually a real book.
Right. Well, so I worked at the University of Illinois Library System.
Yes.
And in the rare book room, they had a copy of the Necronomicon.
Yeah. And once we saw that, our brains exploded. We're like, I can't believe it. It's in the rare book room.
Yeah, that means it's real.
It's real. It's in the rare. It's you can't check it out. You have to go there, and somebody brings it to you, and it's like, oh my god. And
but it was the Necronomicon as interpreted by L. Sprague du Camp. Is that his name?
Right. Yeah. Camps.
I think I don't know if I pronounced that right.
That's
or not.
fine. But he wrote it because he was in on the joke.
Yeah, exactly.
And he put this out there because people like us, and this rumor got started that it was a real thing. And so he published this book. And of course it only had a small run, and that's why it was a rare book, and that's how it ended up in the rare book room.
Exactly. But it was a really fun day going up to the rare book room. I felt like I was in a Lovecraft story.
I know, yeah.
So we don't have a lot of time left. Let's mention a couple other things why people might maybe recognize the name of this author or some of the elements in his work. I know that Metallica has a couple of...
Metallica does have...
they have The Thing That Should Not Be is one of their songs. Call of Cthulhu, actually,
is the song. Yeah.
A lot of John Carpenter's movies are influenced by H.P. Lovecraft.
One, very specifically, is Mouth
of Madness, although there's elements of it in Prince of Darkness.
Yep.
And even The Thing has some Lovecraft.
Oh, absolutely.
What else is out there?
The Evil Dead movies. There's an episode of The Real Ghostbusters.
Sure, Ghostbusters. I mean, he really... if there's anything that is science fiction or horror, at some point there's probably something Lovecraftian about it.
Well, yeah, a lot of... Stephen King wrote Jerusalem's Lot, even mentions the Necronomicon in there. And Clive Barker, in a few of his stories, mentions Lovecraftian gods of the Cthulhu mythos and things. And it's just one of those... It's part of culture, like of horror and science fiction culture. It's just interweaved in there.
And it's exciting to talk about, and we want to talk about it more. Unfortunately, we run out of time for this podcast.
We have.
But what we want to tell you is that the story we're going to cover next time is The Tomb.
The Tomb. Even though he did write some stuff when he was younger, The Beast in the Cave when he was 15, and The Alchemist when he was 18, we're going to go with The Tomb.
I think most people acknowledge The Tomb as the beginning of the H.P. Lovecraft type of stories. He'd found his own voice by that point, and then started writing the good stuff.
So if you could read the Tomb, and before you listen to the next podcast,
and that'll be for next time.
All right. Well, I'm Chris Lackey.
I'm Chad Pfeiffer,
and this has been the
HP Podcraft. Wait, no,
HP Lovecraft.
It's the HP Podcraft
colon the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
Yeah, and if you and certainly write us if you don't like that name. We're up to changing it. All right, signing off.
Bye-bye.
HPPodcraft.com